Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Black Archive Visual Podcast, Episode 8, which is made possible by the Harvard South African Fellowship Program run through the Center for African Studies at Harvard University. For exciting events and all things Africa at Harvard, I invite you to visit our website at www.africa.harvard.edu. Detailed information on opportunities for fellowships, funding for undergraduate and graduate programs, as well as exciting research and public engagement listings can be found on our website. My name is Sisebo Kumalo, your host, and a visiting fellow of the Harvard South African Fellowship Program, as well as a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, where I teach on social and political philosophy, feminist and queer theory, decoloniality, and the Black Archive. Today I am joined by the distinguished John Mugane, who is the Director of the African Language Program in the Department of African and African American Studies. He is a linguist specializing in African languages and is the Professor of the Practice of African Languages and Cultures at Harvard University. Mugane has been the Director of the Language Program since 2003, developing the teaching of African languages and cultures. He is the author of The Story of Swahili, published with Ohio University Press in 2015, Linguistic Description, Typology and Representation of African Languages and Trends in African Linguistics, Volume 5, African World Press, published in 2003, Tujifunze Kiswahili, Let's Learn Swahili, Aramati Digital Publications, published in 1999, and a Paradigmatic Grammar of Gikuyu, Stanford Monographs on African Languages. He is also, among his published works, are papers on Bantu languages, linguistics, and instructional technology. Professor Mugane's research interests include Bantu linguistics, African languages, computer-mediated language instruction, grammar documentation, as well as pedagogy. John received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Arizona, Tucson, and his MA in linguistics from Ohio University in 1991. His PhD was awarded in 1997. A graduate of Kenyatta University in Kenya, B.Ed in languages, literature and linguistics in 1987. He also earned an MA in international affairs, African studies in 1991 at Ohio University. Prof, that's a very, very impressive CV. Welcome and thank you for joining me on today's episode. I want to start off with the 2 decades that you have been directing the Center, the African Language Program in the African and African American Studies Department. Would you care to share with us just a bit of your experiences of what it's been like? What have been some of the challenges and what are some of the victories in putting together such a program and offering such a program to our students here at Harvard?
Well, first is to thank you for allowing us this time and for your energy in the things you're doing. We really need to have these conversations we have taken a long time to talk to each other, ourselves from Africa and our colleagues who are in African studies. In 2003, I came to Harvard because I had started what you call the African Studies track. And what surprised me out of this whole country is that the faculty decided, based the whole enterprise founded on African languages. And so to set up the African Studies track, what was seen to be totally important and necessary is to have an African language program. And so they found me, they called me, and I talked to them. I thought they were going to be talking about teaching a few languages, like most people do. Most schools teach, most of the best ones teach 5 languages, maybe less. But here they were saying any language that is actually in demand by students for academic pursuits and, of course, for research, not just the fact that maybe your people speak it and therefore you want to learn it here. It was for academic and intellectual purposes. And so that's how it came here. That's how we got to come here. Before that, I was in Ohio University and I was directing a program that had every language nobody wanted. So I had African languages. I had languages like Tagalog, Khmer, which is Vietnamese, Brazilian Portuguese, as the other program just stayed with their one language, with the enterprises of the modern languages that have been taught for quite a while and have professional organizations and so on. And so they were curious here, what it is I was doing with all these languages and how one does them. And so when I came and heard what was being talked about, turns out it was that there was demand for this kind of knowledge, and there was a good foundation and reason for having to establish African studies on the basis on an African language program as one of the key elements of one being an Africanist. For a long time, we have met people who do Africa, write about Africa, and so on, and they
cannot speak a single language.
They can't have a single conversation with the people they write about, and that has been not just a problem, but it is actually an issue that needs to be talked about and fixed, and then we have to. Then the proof is on our part. Why does one need to do that? In spite of all the noise Ngugi wa Thiong'o has done in terms of saying we've never heard of anybody doing Chinese literature, but it can be published in Isizulu, for instance. It's, yeah, it is Chinese literature, but it's written in Zulu. But for us, we are the continent of these absurdities that we keep hearing about. But the more interesting thing about the program, and we celebrated its, the center, the department celebrated the 50th anniversary actually, not 2 years ago, I think, and it has come far. The idea of the language program was that where are you going to find the people who are going to teach this language? What kind of approach are you going to use? What is the methodology? And it was all left up to me, so to actually get to set it up, not only just actually bring people to teach it, but also to qualify them to teach. So here, for the last, since that time, 2003, we've been making history by not only just teaching these languages, but also getting native speakers who are smart, who are educated. Usually we get some people with graduate degrees to come and be teachers. They're able to learn how to teach because of the approaches that we actually do. So we have an approach that is not the usual textbook type approach. It is one of proficiency and of literacy that we really want. And the idea of producing language, being able to talk to somebody, in the language, not just learning its facts, and then, of course, in the end, you know a lot of facts, but you can't have a conversation. And that's what we've been trying to do. And we started with just about 3 or 4 classes. And as we went on and on until we got to, that is maybe 4 languages that we started out with. And we ended up with even 27 in a semester, 27 languages from all over Africa and so on. And from East, Central, South, and West, and all these, even the Arabic ones, the Egyptian, the Moroccan, we've done the Sudanese as well, and so on. So it's all mixed up. The 5 families of Africa languages. We have Niger Congo, we have Khoisan, which is and then there we have Nilotic, and we have Niger Congo, which is the big one that consists of our languages, the Bantu languages, and Malagasy, Madagascar, so that's the 5th. And so you have this whole richness in Africa of all these languages that are there. And so how does one direct a program like that? It is not a language teacher that you really need. You need a linguist. You need somebody, because this is now, you're not having people walking to you, having PhDs in teaching this and being trained in that, and there's a tradition, and there are all these things that are being written about how people are supposed to teach. But you have to come now and say, one of the languages we did was Oshikwanyama from, I think it's from Angola or some other place, or Namibia. I think it's maybe Namibia. And then, so some languages I had not heard about, but it's Bantu.
Yes.
So we got it, and we actually got going. And, we've taught Kinyarwanda, we've taught, of course, Isizulu, Isikosa, Siswati, and we taught quite a number of those. And also Setswana, the Set languages and so on. And so it's a whole array of languages that we've taught. We've gone north of more than 5,000 students who have taken these classes all the time, many of them getting to work into the third and fourth year of getting citations in the languages, meaning they're proficient and they are doing actually
Deep research.
deep research and deep reflection and in these languages. And so it's been the very best place I could be. It's almost like I was pinching myself saying, I used to imagine there is a place I could go and have
this kind of program.
Yeah. And also when you come to America, I did German for my graduate school work because the school I came to told me to go to the library and show them the body of work written in the languages of Africa. Then if they see it substantial, then it can be the language. So those days are long past. I mean, so now here we actually not only just teach our own, but we also qualify anybody else with a language that is African that wants it to be a waiver, and their schools can actually agree to that. So
now, Mugane, you have a very interesting point that you usually sort of look at, which is the use of the languages in the disciplines. And this has been part and parcel of your research. This has been part and parcel of the argument of work or the body of work that you've put out in terms of the scholarship that you've developed and that you've written. And I think that this will lead me into the more sort of deeper philosophical questions in terms of our conversation today. And one of the things that, I think is quite interesting and fascinating for me, having you on this program, precisely because I'm dealing with, or I'm trying to formulate what I am theoretically and conceptually understanding as the Black Archive. I'm thinking about necessarily this move that you have been arguing for, which is to say, let us begin to tap into the wealth of knowledge that exists in African languages in the use and application of these languages in the disciplines. And I've got two questions in relation to that. The first, of course, concerns the adaptability. So I'm sure you are aware of Neville Alexander's idea around, quote unquote, the intellectualization of African languages. And while I am inclined to understand the rationale for his arguments, I object to it on the premise that on the very notion of intellection, surely the language is intellectual, right? For the fact that I can speak the language and be understood in the language and get a response in the language, the concept of intellectualization seems to be a bit curious for me, right? So the first sort of question for me is, what are some of the challenges maybe that we encounter? One of them being, for example, that objection. South Africa, Mahmoud Mamdani, and it's the second time that he's coming up in this series. But in 2017 he gets back to UCT and he says in Cape Town, giving the academic freedom lecture there, that one of the strategies for quote unquote decolonizing the university in Africa is to have African languages, intellectualize African languages through translating in. Now, the criticism that I have of that is that that is a position that is slightly epistemically racist. And I say that because the person who makes that recommendation doesn't know the language sufficiently. And yet they say that, you have to have these translations, translate the greats in, translate your Great Gatsby, translate, your Shakespeare's into isiZulu, into isiXhosa, Sepedi, Setswana, Sesotho. And I think about, for example, Black and African writers who have been doing the work of writing in mother tongue isiZulu. Make Mafuza's, for example, collection that came out of the John Colenso School in the KZN Missionary Press that was there. You've got the Lovedale Press existing since 1823. And these are all texts that are often forgotten. So I suppose, as I say, the first question that I have is, what are the challenges of attempting to do the work of bringing in our languages into the disciplines and using them in the disciplines?
So one of the, I don't know how to put it, but first of all, it's a very good question. What does it mean to intellectualize and all that? For me, the part I latch on first is just the challenge that is given to those who consider themselves to be the experts on Africa. And that's why, the language program, every student, or more than the 5,000, there is something we call the Mugane question. And that is to ask, because if I ask, I'm always throwing stones, I send them out to ask anybody who talks about Africa whether they really have conversations with the people they write about. And that is basically saying, how do we obtain knowledge in the first place? What is intellectualization if it is not that we have an idea of what it is? That's what we want to achieve. Therefore, what is it? It is to use data and then use the interpretive lens of Europe, of the West, to actually make meaning of these things. That's what's called knowledge, mostly. And there is some sense to it, but what I see with the African languages in the disciplines and the professions, because I do both of them, is to actually realize there is something fundamentally flawed in the idea that translation it really gets to the core of the issues. It's almost like believing that languages are only there for communication, so that what we need is just to dig in from one language and tell the other person what the interpretation, the translation really means, and that's the idea. Whereas when you look deeper into our languages and you start studying etymologies, doing serious linguistics, not linguistics of just saying you can actually just convert one work into another language and so on, is when you realize our languages are themselves powerhouses of knowledge. And the very fact that we research, everybody who does a PhD in African studies goes to communities, studies them and produces a work in English and French. What does it really mean? You interviewed all these people, and I've tried many times to find out whether I can see the original data from that person collected. I can listen to what the interviews were, but you never hear these things. What you see is books. And therefore you keep on wondering, what is the real source of this material that you're reading? And to probe those things, sometimes you can be lucky enough to actually figure out that is it really true that there's some people who are good in languages, but really what really gets rewarded is the interpretation. It is the explanations. It is all these things. So in linguistics, we talk about observational adequacy and descriptive adequacy. Those cannot be done in any other way other than the original language. And then there is the explanatory. There is somebody who may believe that the explanatory doesn't need the data that you actually took. But actually, if you start listening to our languages and how knowledge is being produced and so on, you will actually hear the observation and the description is really also the interpretation is all connected. So the idea that I can actually write a paper, show all the African language data that I'm actually showing with translations, the first thing they say, remove this, nobody is interested in this particular part. We can see the translation. We believe you that this came from here and so on. But then that means is there such a thing? That I believe there must be. Is there a level, like a chain of production of knowledge, whereby we begin, just like we're going back to what Africa is, the extractive industry that is there in the world that actually extracts things from here, so that the polished diamond becomes the one that is much more venerated than the rock that it was in, or the kind of thing that it was in, and so on. And that is not to actually just say that beauty comes from when it's taken away. A lot of this is just being told right there by people. So when knowledge is being gathered, I think of it, and I'm writing about it, as a heist. A heist is a very clever way of actually seeing things going, and either we are awake to it or we don't. We're just saying basically, this is the way work is done. I would like you to look, and I have done that. I have to look at some works that are written, and you will see how data is being taken in. And then there's a moment in the paper that reaches, and then now they move, okay, that's what this interpretive lens of Foucault and all these other people, Hegel, are saying, because now you've moved, okay, you gave us data, here is the thinking lens, and so on. And some of these things you have to push back and say, but our languages are not only sources of knowledge, but they're also the terminus of knowledge. They're also places that actually can derive all these things. But the burden is on the person who is monolingual. Because if you're monolingual and there are ways that actually things are produced, then you have the kind of world we have. So the reason why I got into disciplines and the professions, that the profession, intellectual production is there, but then it has a practice, which is in the professions and so on. And there is a very big link between this. So I'm very eager. I mean, in Kenya, we've been dealing with issues of language and law.
Yes.
So I work with the law school there, and we have had big people like the former Chief Justice, talking in it, and former Attorney Generals, very, very highly elevated people, and high judges who I talk with. We talk about this language question in jurisprudence and how people get incarcerated because of certain things and so on, and it has a theory to it. It has an intellectual element to it, and then, of course, a practical element of what language is, not just in the production of knowledge, but also in our own practices and even freedoms and incarcerations and so on.
Yes.
All you have to do is you visit the Kenyan library it's online, of laws and cases being tried out, and you look for the complaints about doing court cases in English. So many of them. All you have in Kenya, once somebody says, I didn't understand what was really going on in the court, they appeal on those bases, and then the case is repeated because basically there are all these things. But why do you go to the court? It's because there we know people's own lives can be incarcerated. There is real things to pay here. But it is still back to the disciplines themselves. It is, how do we trace knowledge when the place that it has gone through is our languages, and it comes out and it is in these other languages and so on, whereas you can't even ask. So when you ask, sometimes I've asked somebody who's presenting, so do you speak Amharic? Do you speak, you've told us this wonderful story, and they say, no, I had a translator, and they told me all these things and so on. Not that the work is not good. I don't question the effort. But the idea is that when you ask about language questions, it means there is that kind of level of production, but that's the surface part. The more deeper element of it is the visibility and the invisibility of Africans, or the Ubuntu-ness is what is always at war. Is always what is being removed, so that you actually end up with these works that are produced, yet you don't see. It's like Africans I've read so many books that we are seeming like we are in museums being talked about. There is no voice that is actually coming. There is no rebuttal that is actually happening. So we do have, it's interesting to actually look at what really happens. The deliberations, like when you fought in South Africa, there was the time where you actually wrote a new constitution.
Yeah.
And in Kenya, we took it and read it and tried to do the same and so on. And we actually have a pretty good one in Kenya. But then you look at the actual deliberations that produced it. They show up in an English volume. And there's a colleague of mine here who said, English is an African language. After all, our constitutions are written in it. And I look at it and say, yeah, but the actual work of writing it is not really in that thing. That's a book that actually has to be used by you, but the actual knowledge came from all these languages, and it actually ends up in this particular volume. And so we are always disappearing in the process of deriving knowledge and thinking about things. So
this is what sort of gives me and you raised two sort of really, really interesting points for me. The first is a debate that we've had on the continent for a while now, which is the tussle between indigenous languages or languages of the continent as they sort of brush up against colonial languages, Portuguese, French, English. Some parts, of course, have German. If you go to, Namibia, for example. But one of the things, and that debate, is characteristic of folks like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe. It's usually in literature where you have this kind of contestation. One who says, I stick with the language, another one who says, let's adopt the English language. And it was incredibly pronounced in South Africa in the late 80s, moving into the 1990s. So in 1986, for example, we had Eskiam Pahlele doing that piece titled Prometheus in Chains. And in it, he advocates for the teaching of the English language to the locals, to the natives, to the indigenous population. And he says that the reason why we should teach this language is because we can domesticate this language, we can Africanize this language. This was in 86. 1992, he gets a response, a very lovely response from one of my favorite scholars and intellectuals, Mazisi Gunene. And Mazisi Gunene writes about the problems in African philosophy in 1992. And Gunene says, that was the quote for me that kind of shifted my thinking around producing knowledge in isiZulu, isiXhosa, to the point whereby, for example, both my master's dissertation and PhD thesis move between those languages, English, isiZulu, and Xhosa, right? Because I'm moved by Gunene when he says that English has been the cause of the death of many of our ancestors, right? Sort of rejecting this notion that we could ever domesticate this language and use it and take it up as an African language. And that debate kind of derivatively brings me to a question that I've observed. So, for example, in South Africa now, we have celebrated, achievements of PhDs in isiXhosa, in Chivenda, in Setswana. We have just very recently, a couple of months ago, I believe it was last year, if not the year before, the then president of the Supreme Court of Appeal in South Africa, Judge President, Justice Maya, pens a judgment in isiXhosa, and hands down judgment in isiXhosa. And this is becoming, and this is the judge president of the second highest court in the land. So you've got the Constitutional Court, Supreme Court of Appeals, and the High Courts, and the Magistrates' Courts. And the judge president elects to write a judgment in her mother tongue, which is isiXhosa. And this kind of, we're beginning to see in the country the uptake of indigenous languages for the purposes of producing science, for the purposes of governing society, and for the purposes of conducting the business of the law. And the heart of it, at the heart of it for me, and I've tried this, and it's a very, very difficult task, writing in English and translating from English to isiZulu. Simple, I can do that in my sleep. Because I write and I read isiZulu with academic proficiency, similarly with isiXhosa. Translating from isiZulu to the English is a nightmare. That is an absolute, absolute nightmare. And what I'm thinking about as I'm seeing all of this happening, I'm thinking about the question of translative equivalence. Because it's easier for me to take a concept in English and find conceptual translative equivalence. It might not necessarily be, what do you guys, because there are gradations in linguistics of the kind of translation work that can happen, right? It's easier for me to kind of move from the English into my mother tongue, whereas moving from my mother tongue into the English is far more difficult. And I wonder whether or not in African sociolinguistics, we are looking at that challenge or that question of when we are doing the translation work, what happens to the notion of translative equivalence, and whether or not the conceptual relaying of information, the conceptual relaying of ideas as they are sedimented within culture and bodies of knowledge can effectively take place.
Well, the thing is that first it reminds me of a theologian. Actually, he was a TL. I remember him presently because he wrote this book called Translating the Message, not translating the meaning. I, like you, I have been myself translating some texts from English to Kikuyu and Kikuyu to English. And what happens is that the reason why translating from English to Zulu for you will be easier to do is because the life we've been led with is actually really in the English. And so you come and bring things back this way. When you make the breakthrough of really understanding, because translating is really not just a matter of just taking something and say, this is what I think they mean, and you do it. It is really about the message, the message, the meaning. If you look at, and I don't know how they have translated the national language, I mean the national anthem in South Africa. In Kenya, if you look at the national anthem, it has the version in English, that is actually the English part. There is the literal translation, and then there is the other one here. If you sing it, if you look at the words and so on, it's really not working. The literal tells you, sing it this way. This is the literal meaning of it. Because the song is not coming from English to us, it's coming from Swahili or Pokomo and so on to English. And what happens then is that you accept the translation, but it doesn't look like what people are calling translation, because translation meaning, here is what it is actually you want to translate. If you're translating a sentence, John went to town, then there is not much to say. But if John went to town is in the middle of other discourses, so that John going to town actually, maybe the metaphorical thing of saying he's going to town meaning just gone on his way in his mind, and whatever it is, or it could be something more deep. And so the idea is that knowledge, just like the environment, is language, linguistic, is a contextual discipline. It is actually saying that thing we call language, which I do agree with Chomsky's view that it is really a part of human biology. It is something that is in you, that actually is about the association of meaning with something else. Whereas before you had been told it's an association of sound with meaning. So if you make a noise and so it's meanings we're trying to make. And looking for meanings is really not just saying, here is a text that I need to translate. It is that actually, if you understand it, then you translate it. And something else. Now, if you listen to what Ngugi has told us before, Ngugi Othiongo has told us before in public lectures even, you say there is a time he had a war relationship with English. But then when he went to write in his own language, he actually became a more avid reader of English, because now he was curious. How is this going? How is that going? And so on. Now, for me, so that's the first take, that translation is really about translating the message. Okay. And the person I was thinking about, the theologian I was thinking about, is the Lamin Sane. He was, he just died recently. Wrote about the translating the message, although he's really talking about religion and so on in that. Yes. But it is the idea that when you say, when our languages speak, they are rich in those proverbial things and allegories and all these other things. So when you hear a word, you don't just come and translate it just because this is what, I mean, it feels like it should sound like. You have to know the content. And that's why, so somebody who comes to translate an African language into English, if they're not from there and they don't know that life and all this stuff, how much of a translation is possible, I don't know. And that brings us to the discussion of whether there is any really authentic one. But for me, it's not so much who translates. If you translate and we have access to it, then as consumers then go and sharpen it up. So don't worry about translating from isiZulu to English. If you do, and the isiZulu people are reading it, they will be saying, okay, this I don't agree with, and so on. And so in my translations, I try to find, if I'm translating things from my language to English, and I would write to my language here and the English here, so that if you read and you're saying, I don't understand what he's saying, and then you look at the English definition and so on. The problem with that is that sometimes you might just go to looking at the sentence, but you don't realize this is a whole discourse that is actually going on. You're not translating sentences, you're translating a discourse, you're translating meaning and thought.
And this is why I am captured, if I can call it that, by Emily Apter's work. Right.
You didn't mention it, yes.
because she's, there are two books that I think are quite useful for me in terms of thinking about this process of translation. And at some points, I actually refuse to translate out. I sometimes, because I can do the translative work, I think, can happen in the philosophical analysis and argument. In the exposition of the argument and the analysis. That's where my reader who is foreign to the language might be able to glean some of the insights. Because Apter goes, she starts off, for example, with the translation zone, and that's an older text. And in an iterative, rearticulation in 2013, she gives us, Against World Literatures. And she comes up with this concept of untranslatables. So there are certain concepts, there are certain ideas, there are certain philosophies that are embedded within the linguistic ecologies, right? So particular concepts come up as a result of, and this is again another author who's come up in this series for some time now, and that's the work of J.M. Coetzee. He calls it an Adamic language, right? So a language that is of the landscape, a language that comes, that is birthed of the landscape, right? And when one has that kind of stuff, one finds it a bit difficult to do the work of translating. And Apter then gives us this concept of untranslatables. And in that space of untranslatables, I'm curious about the function then of, for example, the sociolinguist working in consort with the anthropologist, working in consort with the historian, working in consort with the philosopher, right, in order to kind of get us to a really interesting synthesis of these untranslatables, because I'm of the view that they exist. For example, Christopher Miller, has often said that what tends to happen with oral cultures is that they abjure the written, for the written kind of petrifies them into this dead thing, into this thing that is unliving, into this thing that is unmoving. And so oral cultures will want to keep a certain sense of silence when it comes to the writing, because the writing does something that problematically fixes concepts in ways that, for example, that don't allow for the interdisciplinarity that is required in the untranslatable, when we're dealing with this concept of the untranslatables, as we get it from Apter. So in the first instance, is there a possibility for us to work interdisciplinarily? The linguist with the historian, with the anthropologist, with the philosopher, and secondarily, how does that then kind of open up and even maybe cement the concept of using the languages in the disciplines? Because in that collaborative interdisciplinary space, multidisciplinary space, one is forced to really kind of confront the importance and maybe the richness and texture of our languages as they give us something new in the disciplines.
Yeah, so so the thing is that what I see is a skewed indulgence with these translatability translations, because much of it is having highly established and highly established traditions, like the one of English or the one of French and the one of German, and all these have been the languages. They're called empires of the word by somebody called Austin. Austin has written this book talking about the empires of the word, meaning they're languages that actually sprang on top of things, which led me to write the story of Swahili, saying, languages have actually been on the top because they were conquerors. But Swahili comes and says you can actually be one of those without going through that path. The idea is that, first of all, to agree with that, I see the point that is actually being made, but I think the inequality of apprehension, because if you look at our languages, if you take the people working on these things and all the other stuff, are working in a different kind of level. I call it the horizontal versus the vertical. This other one is about verticals. And in fact, sometimes I listen to papers and you get bored because you realize they are rushing through the data so that they can actually tell you these are the story that is actually what is the knowledge, really. This other thing was just, I could have used any raw material to actually do this. But for us, we're talking about the actual encapsulation of Ubuntu, the environment you're talking about and all the other stuff. When a language dies, it's not so much that we say languages don't evolve. Languages just change. And and so when people are looking at environments and studying them and all the other stuff, and those coming to it, especially, so if I was to study Zulu, but I only speak English, and I'm not trying to engage into knowing this place and actually working with people, then learning is actually outside the whole publication thing. And normally we talk about you work to learn. You do not do the learning to go working and so on. So one of the pedagogical approaches that we talk about in our department and that I use actually is a social engagement approach. What social engagement approach goes back to the standard African ways of thinking. You do not just look at Mrs. Ecolais and say, how old are you? Right? How old are you? That sounds like there is a crisis somewhere. It's like I'm standing at an immigration place and they're telling me, how old are you? What's your name? What's your grandfather? No. It is, we get, by being connected, I don't know how old you are or what you actually do, but with knowing you for a long time, our distance from A to B is not a straight line, it's a very smooth curve, meaning I am knowing, oh, Sisako told me they went to so-and-so in school. I know that generation. It must be this and that. Connect like that. Oh, I didn't know he's related to that one, and all these other things, because you're not taking statistics and just say this is who this person is. You're getting to know them. Language learning really happens that way. A lot of the reasons why in Africa we actually have a very, very high record of failing language exams. But you should hear us speaking. I mean, we speak all of them, and we are getting things going and so on. So where is the disconnect between that exam and what we are doing? It is that this one is about engaging. So how much language do I know? We speak these languages, but what we don't do is we don't do exams. If you give us exams, then you're giving us a standard kind of thing and so on. So you end up dealing us in another place. The idea is that I know because I was there working with my hands. So I'm working.
Yes.
So social engagement means then, if you really want to learn a language and you're sitting in a classroom trying to learn like that, stop, get a life, go out there.
Speak to the people.
Go do something they are doing. It's not speaking to them. Some of them will say, I want to go, the kind of letters we get from people in America saying, I want to go help Kenya to establish this and the other. They see themselves as having this agency that they can actually take over there. And maybe it's $1. So the dollar is not really much of a brain thing. It's an enabler. So you go there, like some of our students have done in the past. You go there and find a project. Some of the students who have gone, some students left me here and went to Tanzania and they volunteered in HIV/AIDS clinics and so on. And they stayed there for 3 months. They came back. They were speaking Swahili, but they didn't know what it is that they were doing. They say we talk like this, we talk like this. Why is this little word this? Having all these varieties of this, whereas in English, this boy, this computer, this person, and so on. We're having 25 of these things. What is going on? What is this and that? Then you start explaining to them, you say, oh, now it makes sense. Learning language is really going, you work with other people, and what are you doing? You're trying to actually do something needed by the community. So then when you do that kind of thing, then the result is that you learn this thing, and now again, you sit back I like the image of a cow, the cows that we love so much in our cultures. It takes all the foliage, then it sits down under a tree at the cool of the day, and you should see it chews these things back, and you can see it closing its eyes and even blink. Sometimes I even see tears coming out of their eyes. They are regurgitating what it is that they actually put in their stomach in order to actually, that's what it means. You go to people, and as they're doing their thing, some of them, we had students here in senior thesis, they went and built a water well in Ghana. And this place needed water, and there were all kinds of solutions, problems to solve, and so on. They were not busy there greeting people and introducing themselves. And no. They were doing it because of the project that they had. The same thing with those students in Tanzania who went to this thing. If you're having the results of somebody's medical, whatever, as you're greeting them, you're not saying kunjani, meaning that I'm practicing. I'm wondering also, what do I do with this person? What am I going to tell them? And so you come out of there, and all of a sudden you can actually speak this thing. In Kenya too, there is a minister of, he was a minister of health. He came by here, actually, called Anyang Nyong'o. He's Lupita Nyong'o's dad. He's a professor. He came here and we were talking, and I was telling him, this is the pedagogy that I use, and he said, the pedagogy of going to people, being socially engaged, not a fake social engagement. You don't go there saying, I'm learning a language there for whatever. I have never met an African who has gone somewhere to learn a language in Africa. They go there to work.
Yes.
So he said, one time Kenyan nurses left Kenya, and he took them to Kampala. There was something going on in Kampala, and they were needed there. So they went there, and he said when he went to visit, because he was the Minister of Health, he found that the ones working in the emergency rooms and so on were speaking Luganda in a few weeks. Whereas the ones that are working over there, maybe not people that were not. So what is happening in the emergency room and all this? So it is that there are things that are needed, and you get to learn them, and you get to do all these things, and even get to see somebody in pain, because, somebody's coming, yelling things and so on. You learn. Now, when you go back, just like that cow I'm talking about, you sit back and say, they said this, why? And they say this, and you realize, okay, then you start making sense of it. That's why I see the problem of translating something that's just written on a piece of paper becoming something else, because one of the failures, and this is just a conjecture, one of the failures is that basically you don't know that world. You don't know it. So everything you're going to interpret, you're going to translate according to the way you think things are going, but you've not participated.
Embedded
in it, and embedded in a sense that you are not the superior one. You are not the one who is actually the maker and breaker of things, which we've always seen. You can see the pictures of Africa. Anytime we have Europeans, you can tell that is a guy who is really calling the shots. And they say, no. In our Ubuntu-ness, the idea is basically that we refuse these things. We refuse to be known by statistics and by data and so on. So it means we want depth of engagements and so on. And as sometimes it can be nerve-wracking, but that's the way I see some of these.
Now these
things.
It's an interesting one, because it kind of takes me to one of the challenges I've always had. So in philosophy, we have one branch, of course, being philosophy of language, which is not really linguistics. And every time, I remember the one time it was at Wits University, Sol Kripke visited. Sol Kripke is one of, big philosophy of language guy. He visits and he's doing his thing at Wits, and I was in the room. And it felt to me like he was speaking Greek. It really did. And then a colleague of mine, Ryan Nift at UCT, was at pains, because he's a philosophy of language philosopher. He's a philosopher of language, rather. And Ryan was at pains to explain to me what Sol Kripke was talking about. And I, for the life of me, couldn't quite understand it. And the reason why I couldn't quite understand it was because it seemed to me, there's a different way. I remember as a child, when I was acquiring language, there's a different, the ways in which Kripke theorizes and classifies, categorizes, and chops up language analysis, and the different kind of concepts that he sort of conveys to us. It's quite different for me in terms of how I understood, how I acquired language, and part of it is exactly this thing of, when one is embedded in the language, whether one is born into the language or one is thrust into that language for whatever situation, work, play, whatever you might want, whatever situation you might want to think up. It seems we don't have these kind of rigid categories of signifier, designator, how we move from that to create this sort of taxonomy and maybe this is a shortcoming on my end, because really I couldn't quite grasp it, but I'm curious about how what you are suggesting, which is this idea of acquiring language on the go,
Right.
as opposed to, because and to a certain extent, as I say, that's the distinction, I think, that splits between the linguists and the philosophers. The linguists are looking at the syntax, the grammar, the lexicography of languages, orthography. You're tracing, and that work I'm very happy to do, and in fact I understand that work. But what happens in my own discipline with language, I in terms of philosophy of language, I fail to get at. I really, really do. And the curiosity that I have then is this curiosity around how do we, and maybe this goes back to the earlier question of the experience of having had established and taught the African language program here at Harvard, and what you had indicated of saying, at that point I need a linguist. I don't need, in terms of teaching, I need somebody who understands the function of language, the use of language, and the control of language, and who can be able to communicate that to students. And I'm curious then, which maybe is to say, going back to the previous question, do we not sometimes hold linguists back as philosophers with the kind of work that we do with language and how we understand, classify, and categorize language?
No, I don't think so. The day has 24 hours, so basically you can't do all these things. And normally linguistics is, at least that's how we used to describe it. I think it's still the same. It is the most scientific of the humanities and the least scientific of the sciences. And I like that dilemma of being where facts have to be confirmed. You have to have data. Linguistics is something that actually really depends on provable data, and we rule out things just basically if they don't make sense in terms of what we consider to be data, given some premises, of course, observational, behavioral stuff, and of elements and so on. And we stop at the sentence. The linguistics stops at the sentence. The discourse is basically a level that you find less and less people are talking about. So they want to go from sounds, from phonology to morphology, and to syntax. And when you're doing that kind of thing, what you're doing with sounds, you're taking sounds and combining them, deciding out of the 30 or so sounds, what did a particular language pick? How are they combining them? And all those other things. But then they become words, and they become words that are put in strings and so on, and you're studying all that stuff. What you don't do then, unless you are a historical linguist, is you don't then go and say, okay, where are these sourced from? How old is this? Where did it? What is it connected to? Although linguists are very interested in knowing, okay, this root, like when I was doing the story of Swahili, you find some words are basically Cushitic, others are from that, and you start wondering why. And then you discover it's telling you a longer story of history whereby the Bantu, as they're coming from Nigeria down this way, they actually didn't have cows, they didn't have goats on that side. And so you find names of milk and goats and these things are Cushitic. Then all of a sudden some other things are still Bantu, and others are sounding like they're click languages because clicks were in East Africa. Even the oldest group is still there. So there is this whole
amalgam.
Yeah, amalgam. And in fact, sometimes you'll hear very weird stories being told by people that sound like they're from the Middle East and some other things. Like, the human beings have been doing those sorts of rounds. But linguistics doesn't then go to explaining beyond the sentence, to look at nobody gives you two sentences to analyze at once. It's just a sentence, and then see its properties, and then that builds up to what the whole language would actually do. Then you start looking at them, and what we are really looking for is that thing that we call universal grammar. That is, why is it you and me being born in very different parts of the world at about the same age we are all speaking, even though our parents are pretending they're teaching us? You're going to be taught here and there. So there's a lot of fascinating stuff in there. When you come to language learning, then you need a linguist, because if you say, I say this way and then this, I say this way, it looks tremendously problematic. How do you explain this? How do you explain that? And all the other stuff. And then that's when a field linguist shows up. And that's when, if a language walks to you and you It's not even described properly. It has a sketch grammar and all the other stuff. Then the linguist is the one who actually listens to it and actually starts to look for
And
ways.
setting it out.
Yeah, and setting it out.
Scientifically
Right,
setting it
setting it out.
Mhm.
And then at the end of the day, you know, in ways we are not thinking there is one language that has better vocabulary than others. We know we have vocabularies, and in fact there is lists like things that no language ever borrows from another. You know, things that have to do with the common, you know, like parts of the body. Nobody says, oh, by the way, we're calling this Kiara, but now that I've heard the word the finger, then I really prefer, you know, to change the meaning, because all that is intricately related to where etymologies come from. So that part is what makes the linguistics program different. Whereas the other programs, the major language programs, there's a time, and in fact, you know, it's quite true. They don't want a linguist near them when you know you're doing this language learning. You know, in the sense that the linguists come and they come with other things, and so they are tough like. But I see it as a division of the day. You know, the day is just short, and you have to do these sorts of things. But for the linguist now, the kind of thing we're doing with intellectual production and all the other stuff, it is now beyond the synthesis of sentences. It is the idea that you can go to court really and say this sentence was ambiguous. So linguists go to court as expert witnesses. So when you say do not discriminate somebody on race, or this, there is a way we can read or as meaning actually it's included or it's not included. And so you can actually do all these kinds of disentanglements that are always fascinating.
Yes.
I mean, but in the end, when you're talking about then, that is a part of knowledge, but then what about the person who speaks this language and is in the knowledge economy, where you know you look at all we are doing, and that's where you go to the horizontal. Horizontally, we are solving all kinds of problems in Africa, but that knowledge is actually hardly ever showing up in terms of what people consider to be very, very valuable. Now, except of course the major languages that are the ones that are the languages of knowledge. So you have they are the ones that publish all these things. Now, with the thing that you're calling artificial intelligence, there seems to be another buffer that maybe that's not something you want to talk about, but there is this whole idea of the fact that now the most unknown people, the most unknown element in African studies is really the African language. It's never been conquered by anybody. No one knows really what happens. We talk them and all this, but really they're not known. So if you go to a place, you'll find schools trying to do little grammars of that language over there, but there's nobody who's learning it and then going there to actually do things.
Yes.
And that is where now when you come to natural language processing, they're saying nowadays you can actually get to talk between Chinese and German directly. Each translate, you hear your language and the other person speaks and so on. We try to do those kinds of things. That's where now we're having the digital rush, the idea of our languages as also, you know, being fit to actually find in these environments. But then again, who is going to control those kinds of languages when we actually put them in these places?
And that's a very nice. I've never thought of it that way, and it's quite a lovely way to think of it, which is to say, nobody has ever conquered African languages.
No.
And I think what is exciting for me there is the capacity of reimagining the world through African languages, because they have not been quote unquote domesticated by the colonial project. Right? In the sense of, if we tap into African languages, and this is part of the work that I'm trying to think about by talking to various scholars from various disciplines on this platform, is to think exactly about that. And excitingly enough, you know, one of the conversations in the series here is around thinking about, for example, imagining or conceptualizing the African University with Paul Zaleza. And that imaginative process, I think, comes in through the languages, through African languages, because indeed they have not been, you know, I think about what has happened, for example, with isiZulu down in South Africa and C.M. Doak's invention of the language, because he comes there and he sort of creates this register for us, and he says, well, here is the isiZulu language. And what has happened over the years is that, on the one hand, through the standardization, through scholars like Sibusiso Nyembezi, for example, kind of adopting the Dokian register of the language, there's been a standardization, but that's also kind of being challenged in a certain way, in contemporary ways, which brings me to precisely the questions that will follow on to the conversation that I'll have with Paul around this concept of thinking about the African university. And I wonder, Prof, in your assessment, if you believe that African languages afford us the capacity to reimagine the contemporary university.
Well, I was thinking about it earlier on, I must confess, and it's difficult because what we are reimagining apparently turns out, at least I saw some things that looked convincing. The university did not emerge because it was actually planned. It came from people's life circumstances. They say there's a time people did not come to schools like this one until they have finished their planting their crops, and now they have all these whole season, and they'll be winter, and then they can go and do these things. These things were made the way they operate according to people's traditions and the circumstances they were in. They were not fashioned this way. So when we talk about reimagining it, it is really, we have to go to the curriculum. It's not, it's not anything else. And for me, it is, sometimes we are called to reimagine things. And
that might not require reimagining?
That we are being given a task. We are, you have to remember, we Africans are given, we are thrown problems, enigmas, that we are actually trying to solve over there. And before we know it, time has gone. We actually looked away. So the question is, where is our gaze all the time? I mean, when you say rethinking, reimagining anybody, and by the way, I believe everything Paul will tell you, I believe in, because I like Paul, he knows that stuff. But for what I'm saying is basically, how do countries like Nigeria, we say it has 400 languages, how does it operate? You know, you go down to Cameroon, they say there's another 300 there. There is 200 in the Congo. Tanzania has 120. How do we even make it? Kenya has 40-something. And in fact, a crazier diversity, because Kenya and part of Tanzania, of the 5 language families I told you, they are all represented in there, meaning that linguistic diversity is wild. It's crazy. And so you have to actually figure out, how have we been surviving all this time? Because I keep saying, and that's why I was talking about social engagement, because people have solutions about how they do things. Do we say then that, because once you say 400 languages, 200 languages, you can hear the answer immediately saying, oh, thank God for French, thank for English. And when you go to those places, you discover actually 1 or 2% is the one that has been doing it well since independence. India has taken all this time, and they're still below 5%. We always do these things, and it's just basically a wasteland of these things. People are speaking this language, but they're not the things that are needed over there. So for me, part of the reimagining is basically, how do we go? We ask ourselves, how have we been working and how well can we work? Because then the curriculum comes from the society. The curriculum cannot come from these buildings.
It cannot be imported, parachuted in.
No. Because we are sitting like this and we say this is a university. No, we say, and I'm seeing some of these things happening in Africa right now. I'm seeing my own country, Kenya, change the education to the education of understanding, from the education of just rote memorization, acquiring information, and then all of a sudden, it's just an ATM where they keep on getting the same information. And if you ask the wrong information, there's nobody with a problem to solve there. We're going to problem solving, into all these things. That's what it means. If there are 300 language or 400 language in Nigeria, how do they do their elections? How do they teach those kids? It's not that they are crazy. They will say, no, you're learning in English and you come in. Of course, our teachers came with sticks and they would beat us up. But at the end of the day, when it's all done, if the teacher is not cool enough, some of us, I was not one of them, but some of us would actually figure out how to do all these things in our language, and we would sit there in the evening, and one of us teaches us. By the way, I thought I figured this thing out, and we do it in our own thing, and then we learn how to do things in English. So part of imagination for me, imagination for me is actually inward looking. We can see the imagination we need already in the way we live, for the kinds of problems we solve, and what it is that we think can actually change some of the bottlenecks that we have. Because we do have we do have knowledge production in that continent. We do have,
Yes.
we do run things and all the other stuff, and we have the Ubuntu. But when I look at Europe and it's that societies have developed, if that's what we are really trying to build, then we just go to the monolingual lens. We'll go to all these other things. But how can one do it? You see, like on Monday, when our sister talked there about her paper and all this, and starts with his Zulu, doesn't even translate to anybody, and actually just goes on speaking, is surprisingly an act of that surprises the university. You know, after all, I mean, and then you actually start saying no. That language is much more deeper than the words you're hearing, and so on and so on. It is always saying, get to know me, don't assume me, don't leave me as a spectacle. That we actually so when we are building this university and we are still building it without looking at all these things, because our thinking is in these languages, and I don't know that it is your experience. It was mine in that if you brought people who had been educated to our parents. I remember my father sitting there saying, this is a person with a master's degree, has come from America, and therefore he says, today I'm going to learn a lot. The person opens his mouth and talks, and he says, wait a minute, we might have given him the degree to leave them alone because of the way he's talking and all this. And no, but it's not the complicated ideas that you have. It's to disentangle yourself and actually get things open.
The simpler.
To the simpler. Then what is difficult will always actually be chewed up in these things and so on. So there is that kind of thing that what do we do with our universities when we have the age groups that we have, the kinds of mess we've been given. We were given the words tribalism and all these other things, and therefore we are still stuck in there. And there is always somebody who will come and say, we don't know how to govern. I'm liking YouTube very much. YouTube, there are all these people telling all these Europeans, telling us to be here. You know, you have no moral standing and all this stuff. So there is a kind of but we'll listen to Paul because he's been to several continents doing this.
Yes.
And therefore I don't want even to anticipate what he would actually say.
Yes.
All I say is that one of the ways that Africa gets to do things is what our sister did when you silence the world by speaking your own language. The moment we speak our languages and not translate, the world becomes nervous.
Of course.
We did Ajami literature the other time, and we also are doing Nko. Nko is a language written by the Bamanakan people, the Mandinka people. And we were writing it in their script and writing other things. And so the moment we wrote it in their script and all there, somebody got a grant immediately to translate all these into Latin letters and to return it back to this whole thing and so on. But when I went to the Mandinka people, they had become literate. They were translating Voltaire in their language. They were translating all these complex books and so on. Meaning there is, first of all, a hunger of knowledge in our cultures, in our countries. People are willing to actually be hands-on on things and so on.
But I think that hunger comes from the curiosity about the other, because one of the critical things that I think has always happened in Africa is that when we encounter the other, we are not suspicious immediately.
Right.
We are rather curious. Who are you? What are you about? What are you doing in this part of the world?
Right.
How can we help you? How can you help us? What do you have? How do we exchange? And I think part of it is it's that deep sense of curiosity. This is one of the reasons why, for example, Christianity has such a hold on the continent, because people were curious about this thing. They didn't quite understand it, they didn't quite know it. It gets translated into the languages, into most of the languages. As I say, in South Africa, the press arrives in 1823, and I believe already by the 1840s, you have the Bible translated into some of the indigenous languages in the country. And it's part of it is the curiosity. And this is one of the reasons why, again, for me, there's a very good colleague of mine and a former teacher / teacher cum colleague, Russell Kashula. He's there in the school of Neville Alexander. And at some point in time, I had a very frank conversation with Russell. And I said to him, Russell, this thing of African, of intellectualization is really curious to me. How, if these languages were not intellectual, how did we manage to translate the Bible? How did we manage to learn the languages of foreigners in our own lands, communicate with these people, and be able to set up economies, to set up social economies of existence if our languages were not intellectual. So I think the real component comes from, it comes from that curiosity of not assuming that my world is universal and everything ought to look like my world. Because even if you think about, for example, and we had Kanyisile on this very show actually, episode 4, and thinking exactly about that in the use of isiZulu, in the use of isiXhosa. It's not to say that I expect you to know what I am saying. It is to say, this is who I am. I declare myself in the world in this way, and I hope that my declaring of myself in this way in the world inspires a certain curiosity.
So I agree completely. And one of the things I don't give to Europeans, even though they brought the Christianity, is that basically they succeeded in it, because I went to check. You read things like, there is somebody, I forget their name, but I can send you the reference later on, who came to Kisumu in Kenya. And he asked the local elders and the churches and so on in a meeting, after 150 years since Christianity came, what have you learned that you didn't know about God and about all these things? And he said, after he finished, every person in the room didn't even take time to think. They said, we've learned nothing, absolutely nothing at all. He said, but you are sound Christians and all the other stuff.
You're
practicing, and I said, no. And then I thought, okay, maybe those ones are very sophisticated. I went to ask my own mother's generation, don't you believe that this thing came to be the opium of the people and all this? They say, no, actually, I understand. So they start explaining, giving you exegesis of things and so on. And what you see is the life of a mind, or minds that actually are in existence. In other words, they say, though, there's a talk even that happened in our department here that said if you went to Africa and preached to them in the Old Testament, you didn't get anywhere. They were the Old Testament. They lived like it. So you bring in the technology and all the other stuff, but then you realize the world is not closed down. The world is open. When you go looking at even our songs about these things we call circumcision and so on, the terminology of it turns out to actually be Cushitic. It's the same procedures that they actually do over there, which goes back again to the Middle East. There's a world here that was not closed out of anything. People are still meeting and so on. So one of the things, there is really nothing I see to give kudos to the intellectual element in Africa to the outside, like they came and religion became this Westland. No. They actually remember. It's either Chinua Achebe or some other one of his novels, and that he would actually the person who came to preach to one of the elders in that village and all this, he say, and there is this and this is his name and that is what he do. Then he stops him and says, we call him so and so. Right? And he says, these are the problems. No, we call him so and so. He got furious. Why you don't know this? I'm bringing you new information.
But actually, we have this information,
and so the
just
suspicion,
in a different name.
So my suspicion is that those deep conversations are happening in our languages all the time. But we are not visible or audible. And that's a plan. That's a plan that actually exists. So that, how do you extract otherwise? How do you extract? You have to keep them buried, and you come and extract and go. And this is not an extreme element and all the other, but the thing is that we are smart over there. We know how we're dealing with things and so on. But then because of this whole other confusion of saying, all of you together now, one country, and therefore we have to deal with each other, and we were given all that mess that messed up our grandfathers and now our parents. And now here we are, having gone far away from the place to actually just look for things. I keep telling people, when I talk to my mother when I was this young, don't I hear we were robbed blind here by European countries? I was learning. He said, well, they robbed us, and she asked me if, and this is a story I tell people, he says, if I tell you, now you're born here and you realize, you come here and we say, the Maasai came and took all the cattle. So what are you going to do? You have two choices. Raise a new herd and take care of it, be more vigilant, or pursue the one that actually was taken away. And she asked me, what would your choice be? And I smiled. And if I raise my own, they'll come again. So the whole idea is, you go, and that's my metaphor of coming here.
It's to pursue.
It is to pursue. So it is to say
That
things
was
were
taken.
taken in one direction. So what is that knowledge? We were told, first of all, it's the knowledge. And it is easier and so on. So we have, I believe that once we cut the chair and we start doing things in our own language, first of all, our own self-restriction in terms of speaking and thinking is not going to be restricted to this particular tongue. We are all learning here and there. But now our youngsters, because of all this technology, they're really speaking much better English than the past. So maybe English will still be really good and all the other stuff. But we will be free to think and to observe what we actually do, because knowledge is not coming from books. It is coming to say, you have faced this kind of calamity.
Problem or challenge.
You have managed to tame this environment. And you have all this knowledge here and all the other stuff. There must be something in you, and that's what you're going to look for. We have always done it through dissertations, but then we never see the data. We never see what is going on. So in the end, you hear our publications from Minamama. You told me you're talking to her and all the other stuff. You'll be hearing, and our publications is 3% of everything produced in the intellectual world. Is only 3% that is coming from that vast place. And that 3% includes me and you who are here, who are abroad. So I go first for the idea that and you could ask Paul this for me, as whether if we go and the thing is set up, we will build the same institutions. But if we step back and say now, is there real reasoning in isiZulu? Is there anything? And what are we looking for? What is it? It's not just translating. Translation is going to fail. For me, I leave the APTAS thing intact and the way it is and so on. But for me, it is to ask, does it fail simply because we haven't even considered that they are so unequally, weighted that this one is bringing in 5%, and these ones are bringing 100%. To actually figure out what's really going on here, because often some of our work is being done by one person, they translate and it's in a book over there and it just goes, we didn't check on it and so on.
But I think
it's theorized.
Part of it, though, John, I think is that going to the question of translation, and we can conclude on this thought. Going to the thought of translation, I think this is one of the reasons why for me, translating out of isiZulu, I tried it. I really did. For one journal, they had asked me to. I gave up on the project.
isiZulu to English?
I did. I gave up on the project. And the reason why I gave up on the project is because I had developed a paper, for example, of about 8,000 words in isiZulu,
right,
which when I'm translating comes up to, at the time at least, maybe 15,000. Because isiZulu for me is it is more economical, it has brevity, it has, and this is, I duck, I dive, I swim in this language. I am like a fish in the water in my mother tongue. And then to say, okay, take the fish out of the water, tell the fish to walk on land. That is what it feels like to have to translate out of my mother tongue. And having to translate in, and the reason why it is easy to translate in is because I know my language. I can very easily be able to say, okay, that concept in English, this is the word I'm going to use here. That concept, and part of it really goes to the reason why we get it so wrong, I think, is that translation attempts to translating out of our languages into the English, or translating out of our language into French, into Portuguese, into German, into, Spanish, is that we're trying to capture, for example, the concept of umuti. Just as a simple example. Umuti in isiZulu has two meanings at the very surface level. It is a tree, it is a healing herb. Muti.
Right. It's
Right?
it's actually Bantu, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when I, depending on what comes before or what comes after, you will pick up the meaning of, am I referring to a tree,
Right, right.
or am I referring to medicine? Right? And to try and then export that out is very, very difficult. And the real work, I think, really comes from analyzing. You know, I see it in a lot of the work that I'm doing right now. My footnotes are very, very extensive. I remind myself of old philosophers who used to have footnotes that are constitutive of analyses and essays in and of themselves.
Right.
And that work really is happening because I'm taking one concept, breaking it up. What's the prefixal verb designator that changes the word? What becomes the prefixal noun designator that gives us
Right.
what's the constant concept
You're doing
that
linguistics.
that I'm attaching, that gives me these different things. You see what I mean?
Right.
And part of that has to, it goes into the analysis to demonstrate, I would suggest, the richness of the languages. And this is the last thought then for me here, which is to say, how best, thinking about, as you have indicated, the fact that just in the cluster of 3 countries, you can have more than, say, 600 languages in the cluster of 3 countries alone.
Right.
On the continent. Is it possible for us to develop a collaborative and dialogical exchange between Africa and her diasporic communities? And can such dialogical exchange facilitate systems of innovative critical conceptions of global problems? And I think the latter part of the question has already been answered to say, but we have been solving problems in our context in Africa,
Right.
and we've been attending to, but is it then possible maybe to reach out of the continent and say to the world, this is the gift, precisely because the world has not conquered African languages?
So I agree with this has been a good discussion. The thing with these languages is that basically, first of all, we need to have a blackout. The rest of the world, as we deal with these languages, we need to come out, just like you're saying, if you're writing isiZulu, you need to sit with it, and then when you come out, remember I told you, translate not the words, whatever it is, the message.
The meaning.
The message. The message. Sometimes the meaning of a word might be being, but the message is really not. So you have to go beyond the meaning of a word to the message that is actually being translated, and that is where Christianity is catchy. Christianity doesn't say this is a word for this. It is very clear on etymologies. You go to the School of Divinity, that's all they are doing. They're doing a lot of Greek and all these other languages. Everything you get to the originals, and then you can actually see it. And nobody there would actually say you're sane if you actually did without looking at all these etymologies and so on. What I'm saying basically is that there is enough to even create an alternative idea of a university because of the kinds of things we have. And the fact that every population has all these people, and the way knowledge is seeming to go now, it is seeming very clearly because of the way technology is going with artificial intelligence and all the other stuff. There is coming a day where actually the classroom will be these things, that you can actually be in virtual reality in terms of learning, with your own language. In other words, languages were incarcerated all this time, but if we really can get them to be translated and all the other stuff, it means, and it's a possible future, you'll be able to present your paper in isiZulu, and then that whole system of artificial intelligence actually tells that you're sorry in English, and then of course you can always say that's not what I meant and all the other. But I think it is so much when you have been neglected for so long. The voice is not there. The visibility is not there. It's like museums. It's like in a museum. This is so-and-so used to do this. This is so-and-so used to do this. We don't have histories written. But our languages carry it. And the fact that we can actually be able to talk even the same way people go, Africans would go to a place and put their heads together away from everybody else is part of what our languages do. We are coherent. We understood, and sometimes even create miracles, because if you go with your own language to the same system of learning and figure out what they are doing, because you learned how to actually know what they are really after instead of just memorizing and so on, you'll find very weird appearances of very smart kids coming from all these really difficult places and so on. What is going on is that the mind, is still the same one, and ours has been shut down. And in fact, we still buy into the theories of the inferiority of our languages. It can't be academic, and there is this whole about intellectualization of anything. But intellectualization is the way we've been living and the way we've been dealing with things. I think you should still keep on trying to change isiZulu into whatever. If you go to the message element itself, don't let words tie you down. Because you can always give etymology, that's the footnote part. And the footnotes, then it means that people will actually you'll be reading after and saying, well, that's too long of a conversation. But I think I've enjoyed this because we still have not seen even the tip of the iceberg of African languages anywhere. They're just with us and in us. Our legislatures in Africa, a lot of it, if you go to them, behind the scenes, they're talking our languages. Officially, they're writing these other things. Who is doing the heavy lifting? It is still our own circumstances and our own experiences, and that's why I am happy to come and actually bubble around here, talking about these sorts of things, and we should continue talking a little bit more, because I would like to show you some of the things we've learned about language and the disciplines and the professions, as what is it that you couldn't actually really get with these things. And some of them tell us, this is your subject, but you really don't seem to have grasped it very well, because you're missing the original language and so on. And that means that by missing the original language doesn't mean that language class, it means the actual engagement, like we talked about, the social engagement, the idea of you're solving a problem and you learn things that way. So what we do is we don't learn language, we have repertoires. I come to Switzerland where I'm doing my thing, I'll get that language done and so on. If you give me an exam, I'll do well, but then, some other thing. And that's the genius of the place. But the way the young people are coming on, our languages are mostly endangered. Looking ahead, and our language is judged to be endangered, not so much because it's being spoken by a lot of people now, but when you start seeing the youngsters, they're staying further and further away from it. So all of a sudden you have people who are 50 and above are the ones speaking it.
I think though, John, there are differences, because maybe context specificities, because one of the things that I've enjoyed quite a bit, being in the South African context, and as a philosopher, for example, last year I taught a course to my students, and I said to them, let's take a piece of music. Young people in South Africa, young musicians are singing in isiZulu, in isiXhosa, Tshivenda, and they are taking our languages, South African languages, global, through the production of their music. So I said to them, here's, a young South African artist, musician. He in his composition, he sings in isiZulu. And in his composition, he's making a socio-political claim about the arrangement of society. He's making an ethical claim about the socio-political challenges that we experience, making metaphysical claims by invoking particular, realities that are only known within the Zulu cosmology. And I said to them, is this young man doing philosophy in the popular music that you as young people are listening to? And we had the most exciting debate with my first year's introduction to philosophy. We had the most exciting debate, thinking alongside your Chinua Achebes and the criticisms that they have given of the way in which Europe has written about Africa, thinking with the likes of Lewis Gordon and his conceptions of how, for example, the history of the discipline of philosophy has impacted Africans and people of African descent across the globe. So I think that to a certain extent, part of the work as well is upon us as academics and intellectuals on the continent to take seriously and not abjure the knowledge that remains untapped in our languages. Professor John Mugane, thank you so much for today's conversation and for really having such a beautifully rich and amazing conversation. Professor John Mugane is Director of the African Language Program here at Harvard University in the African and African American Studies Department. Thank you so much, John. I really do appreciate
I've enjoyed
this conversation.
I've enjoyed it, and we should keep talking, and we should involve more people.
Absolutely.
We should engage, in fact, in talking across our languages.
Yes.
So the same concepts in Zulu, the same concept in Kikuyu, then then we start enlarging our minds and also developing the confidence and taking our space more properly than being thrown enigmas that keep us busy when the world is going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Folks, join us next time for another episode of the Black Archive Visual Podcast. I'm Siseko Kumalo, your host, and I look forward to having you join us in the next episode.